Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're going to talk about a really fascinating period in American history, how the country went from having one huge, clear enemy on the world stage, the Soviet Union, to fighting these intense battles over its own identity, right here at home. This is the story of that massive shift, from the Cold War to the culture wars. From activists in the streets demanding the government do something about the AIDS crisis, to people literally tearing down the Berlin Wall, this was an era of just profound, earth-shattering change. All the old rules were breaking down, and new battle lines were being drawn. And not just between countries, but inside America itself. And it all really started with a revolution in Washington. So, where does this all begin? Well, it really kicks off in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. He just swept into office with this promise to bring back American strength and confidence, and he was riding this powerful new wave of conservatism that was about to completely change the country's entire economic and political landscape. Now, at the very heart of his revolution was this huge economic experiment that got nicknamed Reaganomics. The whole thing was based on what's called supply-side theory. And the idea was pretty simple. If you cut taxes way down, especially for corporations and the rich, they'll have all this extra cash. And in theory, they won't just sit on it. They'll invest it, build new factories, start new companies, and that prosperity would eventually trickle down and create jobs for everybody else. So, did it actually work? Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, yeah, Reagan cut taxes, and after a really painful recession at the beginning of his term, the economy did come roaring back. Inflation, which had been a huge problem, got under control, and unemployment went down. But, and this is a huge but, that other goal, balancing the budget, it never happened, not even close. In fact, because of massive defense spending and those tax cuts, the national debt absolutely exploded. It nearly tripled by the time he left office. Okay, so while the economy is going through this radical change, a completely different kind of fight was heating up all over the country. And these weren't about economics. These were battles over values, over identity, and really, over what it even means to be an American. And you cannot talk about this era without talking about the AIDS crisis. And what's just staggering when you look at this timeline is how slow the response was. The disease was identified in '81, but it took 4 years for the president to even mention it in public. Because it was dismissed by some conservatives as a gay plague, the crisis was largely ignored. And that inaction, that silence, is what led to the rise of these incredibly fierce activist groups, like ACT UP, who literally took to the streets to force the government to finally wake up and pay attention. At the exact same time, the government declared a war on drugs. Now this meant getting really tough on crime, with super harsh mandatory prison sentences, especially for street-level drugs like crack cocaine, which was more common in minority communities. And the result? The country's prison population quadrupled. And as you can see from this chart, the impact was devastatingly unequal. African Americans were 7 times more likely to end up behind bars than whites. All right, let's zoom out for a second to the world stage. Because while all these culture wars were raging at home, the one central conflict that had defined the entire world since World War II was about to just end, suddenly and spectacularly. I mean, just think about how fast this all happened. In 1983, you've got Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Classic Cold War stuff. But just a few years later, he's standing with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, signing treaties to get rid of nuclear weapons. Then boom, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself just ceases to exist. The Cold War was over. And this, right here, this was the central, defining question of the 1990s. For the first time ever, the United States was the world's one and only superpower. But what now? What was America's purpose in a world where its main rival was just gone? Well, America didn't have to wait long for a test. When Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded the small, oil-rich country of Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush put together this massive international coalition, 34 countries. And the military campaign that followed, Operation Desert Storm, was just a stunning display of power. Iraqi forces were kicked out of Kuwait in only 100 hours. It was a clear message. America was the new global sheriff. Back here at home, though, the 1990s under President Bill Clinton were, well, they were a really weird time. A total paradox. Because on the one hand, the country was experiencing this unbelievable economic boom. But on the other, the political world was getting angrier, more divided, and more toxic than ever before. Just get a load of this number. $230 billion. That's not a deficit, that is a surplus.
Thanks to the dot-com boom and years of solid growth, those huge Reagan-era deficits were a thing of the past. By the year 2000, the government had more money than it knew what to do with. The economy was absolutely on fire.
But, and this is a huge but, all that money couldn't paper over the deep, deep cracks that were forming in our politics. In 1994, a much more aggressive, confrontational brand of conservatism took over Congress, leading to these brutal political fights over everything: healthcare, welfare, the budget, which all culminated in the impeachment of President Clinton. But this angry, anti-government rhetoric also fueled a dangerous fringe, which exploded into a horrific act of domestic terrorism with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995.
So you'd think, coming into the new millennium, things would just keep going great, right? That 90s prosperity would just roll on. Instead, the 21st century delivered two massive shocks to the system. Shocks that would, once again, completely reshape America and its role in the world.
The first shock, well, it came on a perfectly clear Tuesday morning. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 didn't just knock down buildings. They completely shattered the nation's sense of safety and security, and they kicked off a new, much more uncertain and fearful era.
And the response to that day was a complete rewrite of American foreign policy. It was called the Bush Doctrine, and it basically declared a global war on terror. It argued that the United States now had the right to act preemptively, to go after threats before they could even attack America. And this new doctrine, it led directly to the wars in Afghanistan and, much more controversially, in Iraq.
And the changes back home were just as profound. I mean, we saw the biggest shakeup of the federal government in decades with the creation of the giant Department of Homeland Security. And then there was the USA Patriot Act, which gave the government sweeping new powers to spy on its own citizens. And this kicked off a huge and honestly still ongoing debate. How much freedom are we willing to give up for security? And right as the country is still grappling with the new reality of the war on terror, the second shock hits. This time it wasn't a bomb, but it was just as explosive. The threat was coming from inside the economy itself, and what became the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression.
So what on earth happened? Well, to put it simply, it was all about housing. Banks had been giving out these risky loans called subprime mortgages to people who couldn't really afford them. Then they bundled these bad loans together and sold them to investors as if they were safe. This created a massive fake demand for houses, which sent prices soaring into this huge bubble you can see on the chart. But eventually, people started missing their payments, and the whole house of cards came crashing down.
To stop the entire global financial system from just imploding, the federal government had to step in, and they did, with a staggering $700 billion bailout for the banks. But here's the thing. They were bailing out the very same institutions that had caused the crisis in the first place. And people were furious. It sparked this huge wave of public anger that would fuel even more political chaos in the years to come.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that all of this stuff, the economic ideas of the 80s, the culture battles of the 90s, the trauma of 9/11, and the crash of 2008, this isn't just stuff in a history book. It's the DNA of the world we are living in right now. It shaped our politics, our economy, our debates. These events drew the battle lines that we are still fighting on today. The only question is, what comes next?